The majority of people treat property investing the same way as they treat buying their own property. And that is wrong, and it is potentially costing them thousands of pounds. They pick the wrong mortgage product, they look to pay it all off, and this is because we have been misinformed as a society around financial education right from the school age. So I'm going to be covering in this video the importance of good and bad debt, which is an extremely powerful concept and one that all property investors should know and understand. Why you shouldn't ever pay off your mortgage, and which product to pick for your mortgage to get the best returns from your property investment. So I'm going to be turning your minds upside down, so I hope you're ready. So the first thing we need to explore and to rewire your mindset on is around debt. We have been told throughout society, throughout history, that debt is bad, that you need to pay off your credit card as soon as possible, that you shouldn't even get a credit card. If you've got a loan, it should be paid off as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you're going to end up in financial ruin. You're going to end up bankrupt. Your family and friends will disown you. You'll lose your home. All of those worst case scenarios, and that is what we've been fed, and that's what we associate with debt. And whilst I'm not denying that some people get into really difficult situations with debt, payday loans, loan sharks, etc., that's very different to the concept that debt as a whole is bad. The reason that debt and those situations are seen as drastic and really problematic is not the debt itself, it's the mismanagement of that debt and mismanagement of the finances. People have undertaken loans that they can't pay off, that they've not got a plan to pay off. They've taken the wrong circumstances, often through desperation. So we need to firstly look at that and disassociate with that kind of worst case scenario situation and not automatically think that debt is bad. It sounds obvious, but the worst thing that you can do when taking out a loan is not having a plan to pay it off, and that's the mistake many people make. So that is the first misconception. But actually, a more lethal false belief is that there is actually different types of debt. In his much influential book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki, the author, states that anything that can be considered an asset needs to be income generating. So therefore, things that we normally consider an asset in society, such as your own residential home, your car, potentially your watch, anything like that, cannot be considered an asset because they do not generate any returns. They do not generate you any income. And in fact, all these things actually do is cost you money. So for example, your house has regular maintenance costs, when things break, or, when your roof needs some repairs. And the same with your car, which obviously depreciates as soon as you buy it if you're buying it new. So by his definition, anything that costs you money and doesn't actually make you a return is considered a liability, which in accounting terms means money owed or some kind of debt. And anything that makes you a return that you own is considered an asset. And this is the key first thing to understand. And this is where the concept of good and bad debt comes in. Because if you buy a new car, but you take out a loan to buy that car isn't actually going to generate you any income. It's actually going to cost you money. So therefore, you need to find additional income to pay back the loan on that car. And this car and this loan should therefore be seen as bad debt. And this is where people get into trouble. They buy things they see as assets and they take out loans for them, but with no plan to pay them back. And therefore, they need to earn a hell of a lot more money to then cover all of their loan repayments. And this is where the monthly repayments can really spiral out of control and people get into that real troubling situations. But securing assets, such as a buy-to-let property, should be seen as good debt because property, for example, will pay you a return. It will pay you a monthly income. Because if you've done your numbers right, that rent should cover your mortgage and pay you some money on top on a monthly basis. Because as we know, property pays you twice. It pays you in the short term through the monthly cash flow of the property and the rent, and then it also pays you through capital appreciation in the long term. Do you see the difference here? You could take out a £50,000 loan to buy a property, which will give you a monthly income and cover the loan repayments as well. Or you could spend that £50,000 loan buying a car, which depreciates in value as soon as you buy it. And you also burden yourself with hefty monthly repayments for that finance on that product as well. And this is why our financial education and everything we've been taught in society about debt is wrong and flawed because there is no differentiation between this good and bad debt and the type of debt and what it's used for, and they are key differentiators to understand, and they are really big differences. So let's look at an example deal to really understand the power of leverage. So let's say you had £100,000 in cash and you weren't going to use any debt, so no leverage. So you bought one property for £100,000. This gave you a gross rent of £650, and after cost, that would actually make you £492 income per month. And let's look at 5 years' time. What would happen? Well, we know that capital growth would happen. And for the sake of this example, let's say the property was now worth £125,000, which means you would have made £25,000 equity. You would have also made a total of £29,000 income from the monthly rent. So 25,000 equity, 29,000 income. Let's compare that to if you use leverage. So again, you have £100,000 cash, but this time you do use leverage. You actually get a mortgage at 75% loan to value, which means you have 25% deposit. So you buy 4 houses now at £100,000 each. So you put down £25,000 deposit. After cost, based on £650 rent per property, you make £148 per property net cash flow. And let's fast forward 5 years and see what happens now. And this is where the real magic happens. This is where the real power in this concept is seen. So we're looking in 5 years' time. Each of your properties has gone up by £25,000 growth per property. So each one of them is worth £125,000. You've made a total of £35,020 net cash flow total. The key thing is to think about that each of those properties has gone up by 25,000, which means that you have made a total amount of £100,000 equity. So whereas the first example, you only made 25,000 from one property, you've now got 4 properties and you've made £100,000 equity, and you've also made roughly £6,000 net cash flow more than you did from one property. And that is the power of leverage. And you can see how over time, with more capital growth and compounding, that will just get stronger and better and better. Now that we have looked at the power of leverage, I wanted to tackle another myth, which is paying off your mortgage. Now, I'm only going to talk about this from a property investing perspective. I'm not going to cover paying it off on your residential property because that is a video for another day. I think the approach of paying off your mortgage comes from the fear of debt that, as we discussed earlier, is so pervasive in society but is actually flawed. Now that we have the knowledge of good and bad debt, and we understand the power of leverage and how that is key to building your wealth in the long term and growing your portfolio, we need to question why you would ever want to pay off your mortgage on your investment properties via a capital repayments mortgage. Given that we've established that having an investment property, ideally with a 25% deposit on a mortgage, is actually a positive thing, and this approach is key to building your wealth in the long term, there can be really no rationale to wanting to pay down your mortgage through those capital repayments, because all you're doing here is actually reducing your leverage. You're giving the money back to the bank and you're actually reducing your monthly cash flow and therefore reducing your returns. So why would you ever want to do this? Because also what you're doing is you're really shooting yourself in the foot, because you're actually reducing the amount of capital you've got to invest and to scale your portfolio as well. So let's look at an example to show you the numbers. So based on a purchase of £100,000, a loan of 75% on the mortgage, so that's 25% deposit. So the mortgage on this example is going to be 75,000. And looking at the capital repayment mortgages on this, based on a 5.5 interest rate and a rent of 600 per month, for capital repayments, the monthly mortgage payment would be £824.51. And as you can see, you're only being paid a rent of 600 and your mortgage is 824. Now I'm keeping this simple, so I'm not including any other costs in this. And obviously if there was a management company looking after the property, they would charge at least 12%, including VAT. So that's another cost on the outgoings, plus any voids, plus any maintenance. So you can see that the net cash flow without any of those additional costs is actually minus £224.51. If we look at interest only, based on exactly the same, so 5.5 interest, rent of 600 per month, same mortgage, not including any of the other costs I mentioned, just mortgage alone. Your mortgage on here would be, on an interest only, per month would be £343.75. So that leaves a net cash flow without any of the other costs at £256.25. So as you can see, the capital repayment mortgages actually results in a negative cash flow, whilst the interest only mortgage actually provides you with a positive cash flow, and therefore you're actually making money every month. If you're enjoying this content today, please do like the video and subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate the support and it really does make a big difference. Thanks very much. So the question here is, would you rather make money or lose money per month? And now that you understand the context behind capital repayments versus interest only, let's look at some of the details and key differences. So on interest only, when we're looking at debt, this remains the same on interest only and obviously reduces for capital repayments. So that is obviously one of the benefits of capital repayments, that you actually reduce your debt. But as we talked about earlier, that has a lot of disadvantages and it underdoes your leverage. Cash flow, as I've already shown, is much higher on interest only compared to on capital repayments, when it might be lower or actually negative. Market fluctuations. So with interest only, your debt stays the same, and this means that if the property market was to crash, your debt doesn't go down. So you are more exposed, but this is where leverage comes in, and you've got to ensure that your portfolio isn't too highly leveraged. So that's why most lenders want your portfolio to be at 75% loan to value, to allow for that fluctuations, and so you don't get caught out and overexposed. And if you have the long-term view that the property market goes up and down over time, and that's normal, then this exposure to the market shouldn't be of a concern. And if we look at tax, interest only payments in a limited company are tax deductible. And if you combine both capital repayments and buying in a personal name, then you're going to have higher costs because of you're paying the capital and the interest, and you can only claim back 20% of the interest payments in personal name. So there are some of the key differences and I suppose the benefits and disadvantages of each. So now that you understand why you need to differentiate between different types of debt, and why the prevailing concepts around debt and the fear around debt and paying off your own mortgage are actually myths, you should be ready to embrace the power of leverage to then build your wealth in property in the long term. And do make sure that any properties you are purchasing, that you run your numbers carefully and that they wash their face, and that the rent covers the mortgage payments and any other associated costs, even if interest rates do rise in the future. And this is of course not financial advice, but very much my personal opinion, but you shouldn't ever use a capital repayment mortgage for an investment property, because all you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot, making your returns worse, reducing your cash flow, and missing out on the power of leverage. And in Rich Dad Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki says it perfectly. He says, the rich don't work for money, they make the money work for them. And he also says, the difference between the rich and the poor is how they manage fear. So ignore all of the incorrect advice out there and everything that you've been taught wrong since school, because it is not the system that the rich follow. You need to be investing with the right approach and the right mindset. And if you do, you'll be on the right track to real wealth in the long term. So that's the end of another video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. So thanks so much for watching to the end. Could I ask a huge favor? Could you like the video? Put any comments, any questions? I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, please please could you subscribe? It really helps us to grow and get more content out to the wider property community and beyond. So we really appreciate everything that you do and all the support you give. So thanks very much and see you soon.